perfect square of snow appeared on a hill in Rome in the middle of August. It didn't fall on the roofs around it. It didn't touch the streets below. It landed only on one exact patch of ground, the precise footprint of a church that didn't exist yet. When people reached the top of the Esquiline Hill, they found Pope Liberius already walking across the snow, tracing its edges with his staff, marking where the walls would rise. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't even asking questions. The night before, Mary had already shown him this. Every detail. And miles away, a married couple woke up from the exact same dream, the same night, without a single word passed between them and the Pope. 3 people. 1 message. Mary wanted a church, and she would mark the spot with snow that shouldn't have been able to fall. This is the story of Our Lady of the Snow. The earliest written version we have comes from a friar named Bartholomew of Trent, writing it down in the 1200s, centuries after it supposedly happened. So I'll tell it to you the way it has always been told. As a story the church has held on to generation after generation because something in it kept people coming back. Write in the comments, "Mother, here I am." 2 words. She knows her children by their voice, and stay until the end. Because there's a detail almost nobody includes when they tell this story. It's about an icon that still hangs in that church today, one that popes have knelt in front of before flying into war zones. I'll show you exactly where it comes back in. To understand why this story mattered so much to the people who first told it, you have to understand what it meant to have everything and still feel empty. Rome in the 4th century was a city still figuring out what it meant to be Christian in public. Barely a generation earlier, following Christ openly could get you killed. Now, emperors were building churches instead of arenas for martyrs, and families like John's, wealthy, established, connected to the old aristocracy, were among the first of their class to embrace the new faith fully, publicly, with their fortunes as well as their prayers. John and his wife were not struggling. They were the kind of wealthy that most Romans could only imagine. Land outside the city, a household full of servants, more silver than they could spend in 3 lifetimes. And still, at night they lay in the dark with a question neither of them could answer. Who was any of it for? They had prayed for a child for years. The prayers had gone quiet, the way prayers do when hope gets tired of asking. What replaced the hope wasn't bitterness, it was something worse, a kind of drifting, a sense that all this wealth was just sitting there, waiting for an heir who was never going to come, growing heavier every year instead of lighter. Servants would ask quietly who the new vineyard was for, who would inherit the house on the hill. John stopped answering those questions after a while. There wasn't an answer. His wife stopped going to the market on the days families gathered there with their children, not out of bitterness toward anyone. It was simpler than that. She just couldn't sit through it anymore, watching other women complain about the very thing she would have given anything to complain about herself. There's a particular kind of loneliness in that, the kind that has nothing to do with being alone. She had a husband who loved her, a house full of people, more comfort than most Romans would ever touch. And still, some mornings, she felt like the only person in the city carrying that specific weight. They had tried the things people tried. Physicians, priests, longer prayers, said with more desperation, as if volume was the missing ingredient. None of it changed anything. And somewhere in those years, they stopped asking God for a child and started, without quite admitting it to each other, asking a smaller question. Not why. Just what now? So one evening, without any plan of what would happen next, they knelt together and asked Mary a different kind of question. Not for a child anymore, for direction. Show us what to do with what we have. They didn't ask for a miracle. They asked to stop feeling useless. And the answer they got was so strange, so specific, that no one could have invented it to sound comforting. It sounded honestly like an impossible task. Build me a church in a place I will show you myself. On the night of August 4th into the 5th, Mary came to both of them at once. In John's dream and in his wife's, she said the same thing. A church, built in her name, on the Esquiline Hill. And she would mark the exact spot herself that very night. His wife would later describe it not as a vision she watched from a distance, but as a presence that stood close enough to touch, close enough that the request felt less like an instruction and more like being trusted with something. Not a punishment for the years of silence, an answer to it with snow in the middle of the Roman summer. Read that back to yourself the way someone hearing it for the first time, 16 centuries ago, would have read it. Snow in August in a city where children had never once seen it fall in that season. It wasn't a hopeful sign, it was on its face impossible. At the same hour, across the city, Liberius had the identical dream. The same request, the same impossible proof. An old bishop who had spent his career weighing evidence and settling disputes, given no evidence at all, beyond the feeling he couldn't argue his way out of. Neither man woke up thinking, this was probably a coincidence, some fragment of a conversation I overheard weeks ago. They woke up certain, the kind of certain that makes a person get dressed in the dark and go find someone else before the sun is even fully up. John didn't wait for a formal audience. He went straight to Liberius, out of breath. Still half convinced he was about to sound insane, rehearsing on the walk over how he'd explain a dream to a man whose job was weighing claims about God for a living. He got 2 sentences into describing the dream before Liberius stopped him, raising a hand, his face already changed. I had the same dream. There's a particular kind of silence that happens between 2 people when they realize they weren't imagining something alone. It isn't relief exactly. It's closer to fear, the good kind, the kind that tells you something just got real. Neither man said much after that. There wasn't much left to say. There was only somewhere to go. Liberius didn't waste the morning debating what it meant. He gathered priests, deacons, whoever could walk fast enough to keep up, and led a procession out of the city toward the Esquiline Hill. More people joined as they walked, drawn by the sight of a bishop moving with that much urgency before breakfast, in a city where bishops rarely moved anywhere quickly. When they reached the top of the hill, the crowd went quiet. Snow, fresh, undisturbed, covering the exact patch of ground both men had seen in their sleep, while the rest of Rome below them baked under an August sun that hadn't let up in weeks. People who climbed that hill that morning weren't hearing about a miracle secondhand. They were standing in it, feeling it melt cold against their sandals, while sweat still ran down their necks from the walk-up. Picture a baker who had joined the procession still covered in flour, kneeling right where he stood and staying there a long time. Children scooped up handfuls of it, not quite believing it wouldn't disappear the moment they touched it. Old men who hadn't seen snow since childhood, back when they were young enough to have left Rome for colder places, just stood there with their mouths open, saying nothing. Someone in the crowd started crying before anyone said a word. Word spreads fast on a hill full of people who just watched winter arrive out of nowhere. Here's the detail I promised you. Liberius didn't just stand there marveling at it. He took his bishop's staff, and while the snow was still untouched, he began walking its outline into the ground. This wall here, the entrance here, the apse there. People behind him watched an old man in heavy vestments cross melting snow in the August heat, drawing a building that had existed only in 2 people's dreams the night before. Nobody stopped him to ask how he knew where the walls should go. By then, nobody needed to ask. He was laying out the floor plan of a building on something that, in the ordinary August, would have vanished within the hour. And it held long enough. That single walk across the snow became the actual footprint of the first church in the Western world, built entirely in Mary's honor. John kept his end of it. Every coin he and his wife had been holding onto without knowing why went into the construction. Masons broke ground before the last patches had fully melted off the hillside, working through that year and into the next, raising walls on the exact outline a staff had traced into something that had no business existing where it was found. The couple who had spent years unable to answer the question of who all their wealth was for, finally had an answer. It was for this. A building neither of them would live to see finished in its final form, standing for people they would never meet. For a while, people just called it Liberius's Basilica, but the name that stuck, the one that survived in prayer books for the next 16 centuries, was different. Santa Maria della Neve, Our Lady of the Snow. That first church didn't last in its original form. What happened next isn't legend anymore. It's recorded history, argued over in council chambers and written into the acts of the church. 70 years or so after the snow, a fight broke out in the East over a question that sounds abstract until you sit with it. When Mary gave birth to Jesus, what exactly did she give birth to? A man who would later become divine, some argued. Or God himself, born as a man from the very first breath. The emperor called bishops from across the empire to a city named Ephesus in the year 431 to settle it. Decide that one ruled that Mary wasn't just the mother of the man Jesus. She was, in the fullest sense the church could put into words, the mother of God. Rome took that ruling seriously. The Pope who inherited it, Sixtus III, decided the city needed something more than a decree to make it real for ordinary people who couldn't read Greek theology. He rebuilt Juan and Liberius's old church into something far larger, and he covered its walls in mosaics that still exist today, the oldest of their kind anywhere in Rome. If you stand under that arch now, you're looking at scenes assembled by hand more than 1,500 years ago. Small colored stones telling the story of Christ's infancy. placed there specifically to answer the question Ephesus had just settled. Yes, this is the Mother of God. Look at the ceiling and you'll see the proof a 5th century pope thought people needed to see with their own eyes. Further down the nave, older mosaics still tell stories from before Christ was even born. Abraham setting out for a land he'd never seen. Joshua leading battles into cities that no longer exist. Rahab, a woman history had every reason to forget, placed there deliberately because she turns up generations later in Christ's own family line. None of it is random. Somebody in the 5th century sat down and planned an entire visual argument in stone, and it's still on that wall today for anyone willing to look up. Sixtus also gave the Basilica something else, a small relic said to be a piece of the manger Christ was laid in as an infant, kept beneath the high altar to this day. For that reason alone, Romans have called this place the Basilica of the Holy Nativity for longer than most of its other names have existed. To a Christian standing in Rome, this church has always meant one thing above all else: Bethlehem, brought home. Over the centuries, the Basilica also became a resting place for popes themselves, long before Francis chose it. Sixtus V is buried there, in a chapel built specifically for him. So are Clement IX, Paul V, and Nicholas IV, among others. The sculptor Bernini, the man behind half of Baroque Rome, chose to be buried there too, in a grave so simple most visitors walk past it without noticing. That building, finished around the year 440, is essentially the one still standing on the Esquiline today. You can still walk into it today. It isn't called Our Lady of the Snow in everyday speech anymore. Most people know it as Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Mary Major, the largest church in Rome dedicated to the Virgin, and one of only 4 papal basilicas in the entire world. It sits near Termini, Rome's main train station, close enough that visitors stepping off a train from the airport can be standing under those 5th century mosaics within 20 minutes if they know where to look. But the old name never fully disappeared. It stayed printed in the Roman Missal, feast after feast, all the way until 1969, and every August the church still marks the dedication of St. Mary Major on its liturgical calendar, the direct descendant of a feast that started with 2 strangers dreaming the same impossible thing. And every 5th of August, for longer than most nations have existed, that basilica repeats the miracle in the only way it still can. Since real snow in a Roman summer isn't something anyone can arrange twice, they drop white flower petals from an opening high above the chapel where the image of Mary is kept. It falls slowly, catching light, settling on the floor the way snow would have settled that morning 1600 years ago. The chapel is packed by then, tourists standing shoulder to shoulder with people who've flown in specifically for this one evening. Someone always starts recording on their phone the moment the first petal drops, and almost every year, somewhere in that crowd, someone starts crying before the petals even reach the floor. It's not snow. Everyone in the room knows that. And it still makes people cry every single year, because for a moment the room remembers what it's imitating. Inside that same chapel hangs the detail I told you to wait for. An ancient icon of Mary known as Salus Populi Romani, the health of the Roman people. Tradition holds it was painted on a table St. Joseph built with his own hands, and finished by St. Luke himself. Whether or not that's literally true, what isn't in question is how many times Rome has run to that face when everything else felt like it was falling apart. The painting itself is small compared to what surrounds it, dark with age. Mary looking straight out at whoever stands in front of her, holding her son close against her chest. It's been restored more than once over the centuries, most recently in 2018, so what pilgrims see today isn't quite what Gregory the Great saw in the 6th century. But the composition, the posture, the direct gaze, all of that has stayed essentially the same for longer than most languages on earth have existed in their current form. Every year, on the 15th of August, that icon still leaves the basilica the way it did during the plagues and the wars, just for a gentler reason now. An image of Christ is carried out from St. John Lateran, the Pope's own cathedral across the city, and brought down a road built specifically for this purpose, to meet Mary's icon at Santa Maria Maggiore. Mother and son, reunited for one afternoon on the Feast of the Assumption. The first time was in the year 590. A plague was tearing through the city, the kind that filled carts faster than anyone could bury the dead. Pope Gregory the Great, the same pope history would later call great, ordered the icon carried through the streets, not once, for 3 straight days, through neighborhoods where people were too sick to stand in their own doorways. On the last day, as the procession reached a fortress on the banks of the Tiber, Gregory looked up and saw something. An angel, standing on top of the walls, sheathing his sword. The plague broke not long after, and that fortress never went back to its old name. Rome started calling it Castel Sant'Angelo, the Castle of the Holy Angel, and it's still called that today, one of the most photographed buildings in the city, named after a vision that happened because a pope carried Mary's face through a dying city for 3 days straight. The icon went quiet for a long stretch after that, kept behind glass, brought out for feast days and little else. Then, in August of 1837, cholera reached Rome. It moved through the poorest neighborhoods first, along the Tiber, in Trastevere, in the Borgo, the way it always seemed to move through the parts of a city with the least room to breathe. People were dying fast enough that some families stopped reporting the deaths, afraid of what quarantine would do to whoever was left. Pope Gregory XVI had the icon carried out again, this time to a Jesuit church across the city, deliberately avoiding the neighborhoods hit hardest. Out of the same instinct the doctor has to not spread what's already spreading, he walked the route on foot at the head of the procession in the open air, at a moment when plenty of his own advisors thought gathering any crowd at all was a mistake. He went anyway. By October, the worst of it had passed, and Rome held a mass of thanksgiving at the very altar where the icon usually stayed, not because anyone could prove what had turned the tide, but because the people who had buried neighbors that summer needed somewhere to bring their relief. The next time was 1944. German troops were dug into the city as Allied forces closed in from the south, and for weeks nobody in Rome knew whether their home would still be standing by winter, or whether the fighting that had already leveled towns across Italy was about to reach their own street. Pope Pius XII prayed in front of the Salus, asking that the city be spared the kind of destruction already flattening other parts of Europe. Rome fell to the Allies within days, largely spared the block-by-block fighting that had gutted so many other European cities. No burned churches, no leveled neighborhoods, no ruins where the ancient monuments used to stand. Pius didn't call that luck. He had the icon formally crowned, an honor the church reserves only for images it considers genuinely miraculous, in open thanksgiving for a war that could have taken this city apart the way it took apart so many others. 10 years later, that same pope declared a special marrying year across the whole church, and had the icon carried out one more time, this time on a route from Santa Maria Maggiore all the way to St. Peter's, through streets that had been rubble a decade before and were now simply streets again, full of people going about ordinary Roman life, plague, cholera, an army at the gates, peace finally, celebrated in the same breath as the crisis that came before it. 4 different centuries, 4 completely different reasons for fear, and every single time the response from Rome was the same. Not a new prayer, not a new saint. The same painted face in the same basilica that started with snow falling where it had no business falling. The devotion never stayed inside Rome's walls either. Over the centuries it crossed the Alps into other parts of Europe, and eventually the ocean, carried by missionaries and settlers into Latin America, where towns and parishes still bear the name Our Lady of the Snow today, thousands of miles from the hill where the story began. Somewhere right now in the church that has never once seen real snow, someone is praying in front of an image with that same title for the same reason people always have. More recently, one pope in particular made a habit of stopping in front of that same icon before every trip he took outside Italy, and again the moment he landed back home. Before flying into places that scared even his own security team, he knelt in that chapel first, in keeping with a tradition of his religious order that reached back centuries before him. That pope was Francis, and when he died in April of 2025, he asked to be buried not under St. Peter's, where nearly every pope before him had gone, but here, in this basilica. A few steps from the icon, he had trusted with his travels for 12 years. He became the 8th pope laid to rest inside these walls, the first in more than a century to choose anywhere other than the Vatican. His tombstone carries a single word: Franciscus. Something else happened at that same basilica just months before this video. Rome had been holding a Jubilee year, one of those holy years that comes only once every generation or so, when 4 specific doors across the city are opened for pilgrims to walk through. Santa Maria Maggiore holds one of those 4 doors. By the time the Jubilee year was closing, more than 20 million pilgrims had walked through it, and of the 4 papal basilicas in Rome, this was the very first one whose door was sealed shut again on Christmas evening, the same night the church celebrates Christ's birth. People who were there that week weren't only queuing for the door, they were queuing to stand for a moment at Francis's tomb a few steps away, in the same basilica he had trusted with his safety for 12 years of travel, the same one where a couple named John once knelt not knowing what to do with everything they had. His grave is nothing grand. A plain marble slab, one word carved into it, no towering monument like the ones marking other popes in that same building. People who visit say that's exactly why it stops them. After everything the man asked from that basilica and everything the basilica had already given the city for 16 centuries before he ever arrived, what he chose for himself was the simplest stone in the room. Same church, same image, 1600 years apart, and people are still walking in for the same reason John and his wife did. Because they didn't know what to do with what they were carrying, and they needed somewhere to put it down. Think about everything that one dream turned into. A married couple with no children to leave anything to ended up without meaning to. Leaving something to every single person who has ever walked through those doors since. A plague victim in 590. A cholera patient in 1837. A frightened family in 1944. A pilgrim standing in line this past Christmas waiting to touch a door that only opens once every generation. An old pope who wanted to come home to that exact spot when his own life ended. None of them knew each other. Most of them were separated by centuries. And every one of them ended up in the same room in front of the same face because two people once knelt down and asked what to do with what they had. That's the part of this story that stays with me longer than the snow does. Not the miracle itself, but what the miracle was actually for. Nobody in that story got rich. Nobody got famous. They got a place to bring what they couldn't carry alone, and so somehow did everyone who came after them. Before the prayer, I want to tell you something. She isn't the only one listening from heaven. There are other intercessors who hear us too. Saint Benedict, who protects against evil. Padre Pio, who carried the wounds of Christ in his own body. Saint Joseph, patron of the family. Saint Rita, the saint of the impossible. Saint Michael the Archangel, the warrior of God. And Saint Monica, who cried for 30 years for her son's conversion and was heard. I gathered their stories, their prayers, and their spiritual teachings into a devotional guide to help you pray for your home, your children, and your life of faith. It's called 7 Powerful Intercessors to Protect Your Faith and Your Family. You'll find it in the first pinned comment under this video. Look for it right after the prayer. Let's close this time together with a prayer. Everything you just heard, the dream, the snow, the plagues, the war, the door that closed this past Christmas, all of it points back to the same simple thing. Someone asked and she answered. If someone is on your heart right now, someone who's suffering, who's far from God, who's sick, who's in danger, bring them with you into this prayer. She is listening. Our Lady of the Snow, you answered the quiet prayer of a couple who simply didn't know what to do with everything they'd been given. Today there are families who don't know what to do with what God has placed in their hands either. Their time, their work, the little or the much they have. Help them offer it to you the way John and his wife finally did on that August night. Intercede. You appeared the same night to 2 people who had never met, showing that your message reaches people even while the rest of the world is asleep and unaware. Today I ask for everyone who feels like their prayers disappear into silence, like no one is listening. Let them know they are not alone. That you visit them too, even if it isn't in a dream, even if it's in some small sign they haven't learned to recognize yet. Intercede. You mark the exact place for your church, with snow in the middle of summer when it looked impossible. Today I ask for everyone building something that feels impossible right now. A family holding together on very little. A faith holding on through real doubt. A body holding on one day at a time. Let them find, the way Liberius found that morning, the sign they need to keep going. Intercede. You watched over a man who trusted you with every journey he ever took and who came home to you in the end to rest a few steps from your face. Today I ask for everyone who feels far from home right now, far from peace, far from the people they love. Bring them home too, however that looks for them. Intercede. Our Lady of the Snow, intercede for us. Amen. If you cried at any point during this video, that wasn't for nothing. God doesn't waste tears. Every one of them is a prayer she gathers up. Write in the comments, Mother, intercede for me. And if there's someone you want to ask her intercession for, write their name too. Just the name, she knows the rest. If this video reached you, share it with someone who needs it today. Someone who's struggling and doesn't yet know there's a mother in heaven waiting for someone to tell them so. You can be that someone. Give this video a like so this channel can keep bringing these stories to more families. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Right now on your screen another story is appearing. Another intercessor God prepared for you too. Click it. I'll see you there.